first lecture for English 123. I intend these lectures to just give you some context for the reading that we have done today, which will be Wednesday when you view it. You will take the quiz after you read, ideally by midnight on Wednesdays. And then this mini lecture is just to guide you through some of the questions that might come up as you're reading. So just to talk a little bit about Defoe, first of all. Daniel Defoe was just a very bizarre author who really was involved in a lot of different aspects of 18th century society. And just to give you a little bit of context about Defoe, I know some of you have already read his works in other classes, but he thought of becoming a clergyman in 1681, and then he became a businessman. He was very enthusiastic about business, and we can see a lot of this reflected in Roxana. Roxana is very interested in becoming a businesswoman. We'll see this more in the next section of the book. But Daniel Defoe just did a whole lot. He made perfume out of cats. He also was a notorious political pamphleteer who made fun of Tories. He was imprisoned for that, in fact. And you can see right away, right as the book starts, notice that right away Roxana mentions that her parents were banished from France for being Protestant. So that might tell you a little bit about Daniel Defoe's politics and how he defines himself sort of as in some ways anti-Catholic. And that comes up, I think, throughout the book and also throughout Daniel Defoe's life. So he also dabbled in early journalism. Two of his very famous works, The Storm and Journal of a Plague Year, I know some of us read last quarter as well. So he really did all of these things. And he's also one of the founders of the early novel. And that's what we're really talking about today. And that's the relevant part of Roxana and why I have Roxana on this syllabus, in addition to featuring, we see at the end of the reading that she becomes, she is a widow at the end of, sort of a widow at the end of the reading for today. Now that I'm saying that, it's a little bit difficult sometimes to categorize exactly where each of these, the characters that we're going to be coming across in the syllabus, they don't always fit very neatly into the categories of spinster or widow, but I think that they will allow us to talk about these questions that have come up in class. So just to tell you a little bit about Roxana, when it was first published, it was published anonymously, which means no one knew who wrote it. And it became very popular, but it wasn't attributed to Defoe until later in the 19th century. And it had no copyright. There was really no copyright law at this point. And so it became so popular that people would take it up and rewrite it. And there are multiple endings of Roxana. It's not entirely clear which ending is Defoe's, because as we will see, there is sort of an unfinished ending when we get to the end of Roxana. And so people sort of took this as an inspiration to write their own ending, and that's what they ended up doing. So I think the question that comes up now is, what exactly is a novel? And what is specifically an 18th century novel? And the 18th century novel looks very different from the 19th century novel. And it is really, I think, it is a genre that is in formation, it's in flux. And I think other questions that are coming up at this point, what exactly is fiction? If you look at the title page of Roxana, if you look at the preface, the title page of the preface, they say it's supposed to be a history. It's a true story. It's not fiction. And that is an important distinction, and how some of the early writers of the early novel saw themselves writing true history and drawing from history. This is a genre that informs the early novel in many ways. And we can just see what the novel looks like in the early stages of its development. That's one of the reasons why Roxana is so fascinating, is because it's doing all of these things and it's trying to figure out what a novel is exactly. I think Defoe was really interested in this, and many of the things that he does then were taken up in later fiction, and people sort of he was one of the pioneers of this genre, really. So this idea of a true story, of a history, of not being self-consciously being not being fiction. I think these are all things that allow us to talk about the idea of realism. And when we talk about the early novel form, when we talk about the 18th century novel, we always will talk about the term realism. What that means is basically just it's realistic detail. When you pick something up and you read it, when you pick up a story, does it seem to be realistic to you, or does it seem to bring in something that is not entirely realistic? And also, I think it's important to note that realism meant something different at this time, in the 18th century, than it did at other times. For instance, we as modern readers might not find it particularly realistic when we start to count all of Roxana's children. I mean, we've started to see this in the first section of the novel, that Roxana has many children who sort of just don't really seem to factor into the novel very much. Keep an eye on that. That's one of the things that people sort of will point to and say, this doesn't seem very realistic. And there are parts of the novel that don't seem totally realistic. Another interesting thing that might seem to contradict what we think of as realistic detail, the novel, there are some mistakes in the chronology of the novel. The first page, I think, says that it's that Roxana is born in 1683, but there are multiple historical events that happen over the course of the novel that don't line up with that exactly. So some people have speculated that the novel actually is set at different times. In some ways it is set in the late 17th century. In other ways, it seems to be more a product of its time. It was written in 1724, and it doesn't seem like that far off, but there are major differences in how that's being portrayed. So, okay, so far we've talked a little bit about realism. We talked about the novel, and the novel, one of it's often tied to something called the rise of the novel. Oftentimes we'll talk about the rise of the novel, and the rise of the novel is basically a theory that is linked to the rise of the middle class in the 18th century. And the theory is that as the novel gained popularity, the middle class was growing as well. So this is something that, well, we can talk more about it. There's a lot more that goes into it. But basically the idea is that the novel suddenly became a very, very popular form. And what exactly made it so very popular? In part, it's realism. In part, and there are other things that might have made it popular as well. Obviously, Roxana is a very entertaining novel, I think, as well. It's delving into all kinds of things, into crime, into romance, into some major conflict. But things that drove the rise of the novel, not only the rise of the middle class, but also possibly changes in literacy rates. More people were becoming more literate. The middle class was wanting something to read, and they're wanting something to read that reflected them. And also advances in technology, in printing technology specifically. So suddenly, not suddenly, but fairly gradually, people had more access to books, and they had more say in what they wanted to read. So just to talk very specifically about Roxana and what's going on here, some of the things that we might talk about that link it to the class theme, you might notice that there's a pretty explicit critique of marriage going on. And for instance, we see at one point, Roxana is talking about what a fool her husband is. And she says at one point, it's better to be an old maid than to marry a fool. And she says that, and then also she gets into it a little bit more when she is, I think at one point when after her husband just leaves her with her 5 children, and she just is sitting there and completely destitute, surrounded by rags, trying to figure out what to sell off. I think that there's a very explicit critique of marriage going on here. And it might be helpful to think about that in relation to Mary Astell. I introduced Mary Astell, who was a late 17th century writer who wrote a very explicit critique of marriage too. Now, Defoe and Mary Astell would definitely disagree about some things because she was more conservative, Tory. He was definitely Protestant, Whiggish. But I think that these things are it's interesting to kind of look at these two these critiques of marriage that are kind of coming out in the early 18th century. It also, I think, is worth noting that Roxana is really interested in getting a contract. The concept of jointure comes up on page 50 if you have this edition of the text that was recommended. If you don't, you can also just Google, or not Google, you can do a full text search and look for jointure, and you'll see that Roxana's landlord, who she enters into some kind of a relationship with, offers her first a contract, and that is not marriage because both of them are already married. And then also he offers her jointure. So he basically offers her an inheritance if he is to die, which of course he does. And so we'll see the implications of this in the next stage of the reading. But I think it's interesting how this concept of jointure comes in, even though Roxana is technically still already married. Her husband is just off stage, and she's basically a mistress, and there's a lot of the novel is just coming to terms with what she has to do, what she feels she has to do to survive. We also, I think, we'll definitely need to talk about Roxana's relationship with Amy. This friendship is something that would be really, I think, we could have a rich discussion about Roxana's relationship with Amy and how that is in some ways just going to influence the rest of the book. So I'll stop there because this is already getting a little bit long. I typically try to keep these around 10 to 15 minutes or so, but hopefully that gives you some ways into thinking about the novel and thinking specifically about what the novel is trying to do here.